Hi, Professor Dyer here, talking about research methods in human development and family science. I want to spend a little time talking about the statistics that we find in prevalence studies. These will show up in other studies too, but let's get to know them within the domain of prevalence studies. Um, there are a few things I want to talk about. I'll share my screen that relate to just how often something happens when that thing is it's a categorical variable. It either happens or doesn't happen. And we just want to know how often is it happening. And so uh, here we go. Describing prevalence data for categorical outcomes. We'll just start with this one first. For things that happen very commonly, like more than 1% of the time, we can just use simple proportions, which is presented as just a percentage of something. When something happens less commonly, less than 1%, then simple proportions are harder to follow. They don't make quite as much sense. They're not as intuitively meaningful. And when people say it's 0.5% or 1/4% or a 1/10%, these start not to be quite so intuitive. And so we tend to use rates for them. But what I hope you see is that rates and proportions are the same thing. They have the same basic meaning. Let me just show you some proportions. When we use proportions, here's this report from the Pew Research Center. What proportion of adults 25 and older have never been married? It's very intuitively meaningful for any of us to look at that and say, oh, look, 23% of men have never been married and 17% of women have never been married. And it looks like that percentage has been going up since 1960. So people are presumably delaying marriage. They are getting out of marriage. They are choosing never to marry more than they ever did before. We've gone from about 9% to about 20% of adults have never been married. Now, all that's very intuitive. We don't need to worry about that really. Here's another example. What percentage or what proportion of women who have children aged the small print there tells us the operational definition of mothers with young children is mothers with at least one child under the age of 6 who live in their house with them. So what percentage of mothers with young children have been employed? And you can see that mothers of young children, it looks like in 2023, about 70% of them are employed. And you can see it went, I was going to say it went down a bit probably with the pandemic, but it's coming back up. And at this point, it's even higher than it was prior to the pandemic. So 70%, about 70% of mothers of young children are employed. Mothers of older children are a bit more likely to be employed, about 75%. And in general, women in general, about 77% are likely to be employed. All that's very intuitive, and you can tell exactly what's happening by looking at the graph, which uses percentages. When the proportion is smaller than 1%, then percentages don't make quite so much sense anymore. So then we start using rates. Please do not be intimidated by the concept of a rate. It is just a very small proportion. There are two kinds of rates. I'll talk about both of them. The crude rate is just the number of people per population size when you don't have any other information about them. So for instance, governments of every country in the world keep track of how many people are born in a given year. And so they can say, our crude birth rate is such and such. Our crude death rate is such and such. These are general trends. They mostly work perfectly well. I'll show you a couple of examples and then we'll come back to general rates and how they're different. But here's 144 years of marriage rates in blue and divorce rates in orange in the United States. Let's look at the marriage rates for right now. You can see that Uh, the rate is about, well, if we go back to 1860, it was about 9 people per every 1,000 people in the country got married in that particular year in 1870 and 1880. It stayed at 9. People were getting married more around 1900. It gets real spiky, kind of crashed in the 1930s where the marriage rate dropped. It went up ridiculously after World War II. We had the very, very high marriage rate right after World War II. And then it dropped kind of lower than it had been, and went up again in the 70s, and in the 80s it started to decline again, and the marriage rate has in fact been on the decline since about 1980, 1985. And it looks like now our marriage rate is lower than it has been at any time in our history that we've been looking at it. So it's pretty easy to read. It tells you something. It tells you some interesting things. The problem with a crude rate like this is that not everybody can get married. Children cannot get married, can they? You legally have to be an adult to get married. And so with that really high marriage rate right after World War II, we had a baby boom. And a lot of babies were born, and the birth rate went way up. That's not on this graph, but the birth rate went way up there for a decade or so. And that is why for a decade or so after, the marriage rate looks like it dropped real low. It didn't actually really drop real low. It's just that those were all a bunch of babies and they're not allowed to get married, and we would have wanted them to get married anyway. So you have these complications built into the data because of eligibility. People who are babies are not eligible to be married. And so sometimes you see ups and downs that aren't really terribly meaningful. No one would really say that marriage fell out of favor in the late 50s and early 60s. That didn't happen. Marriage was still highly valued in the United States, and it hadn't really changed very much at all. The value of marriage, the reason the rate appeared to drop is that there were a whole bunch of babies who couldn't get married. So with crude rate data, you have some of these fluctuations and variations that don't make sense. The way to resolve that is to instead, and I'm going to go back to the slide that I just was, to instead use a general rate. And that is calculated as the number of, in this case, marriages per 1,000 people, but only per 1,000 people who were actually eligible for marriage. So general rates use additional information that help present information that is more reasonable. It's kind of normalized a little bit for things like eligibility. So here is a marriage rate graph that is looking at specific eligibility, and you can see the red line there is marriages per 1,000 unmarried women, and they have to be at least 15 years old, because if you're younger than 15, you couldn't possibly be married. The blue line says, well, let's look at only women who are kind of in their maybe what used to be considered marriageable age. So between 15 and 44. And yes, we recognize that maybe people get married older than age 44, but those are unlikely to, let's say, be first marriages. So maybe they'd be excluded. So the person reading this gets to decide, what do I think is the better definition, the better definition of eligible for marriage? Do I really just kind of care about first marriages, in which case I might want to look at the per 1,000 unmarried women 15 to 44, or do I care more just about marriage rates in general? And being a person who's over 44, I'm more interested in just women who could get married, not necessarily just young women. So I'm personally going to say I'm going to look at that red line. And I can see here that marriage rates did in fact decline a little bit in the late 50s and early 60s. I don't think there was a dramatic change in how people conceptualize marriage, but that is interesting. There was a little bit of a change. It bounced up a bit around 1970, but then started going down again. That is how general rates are different from crude rates. Now, generally, I would say that a general rate is probably better. We don't always have general rates, so not to worry for most of the kinds of things we're looking at. A crude rate is okay. The main reason I want to point this out to you, that there's a difference between crude rates and general rates, is that if we look at the actual numbers here, it says around 2010, the crude marriage rate looks like it's about 7. The general marriage rate, we don't have 2010, but we have 2000, was 50. This makes sense, of course, because they have a different baseline, but this is just word to the wise. If you're looking at a rate, be sure you know if it's crude or general so that you don't accidentally say, oh my gosh, I saw in 2000 the marriage rate was 50 and by 2010 it had dropped to 7. You may accidentally think that something drastic has happened when it really hasn't, and you're just looking at different kinds of rates. So here's my overall messages about proportions and rates. Proportions are easy to interpret because they are intuitively meaningful. So no one really has a problem with that. Please do not be intimidated by rates. They are really just proportions, but proportions of things that are less than 1%. So it doesn't make sense to put them in the percent format, but they are essentially the same thing. It's a number of people it happened to out of a number of possible people. The crude rate is a little less sophisticated, but usually for our purposes, it's good enough. General rate is more sophisticated. It accounts for eligibility. Therefore, it's somewhat more precise. Incidentally, when we compare, say, a marriage rate among Hispanics to African Americans, to Asian Americans, to white Americans, we're using general rates. Anytime you compare groups to each other like that, that's based on general rates. And so that is a much kind of it makes general rates much more interesting and useful because we get that more granular information and we can make comparisons that are really interesting. So general rates are usually the better thing to be looking for, but crude rates are often good enough. Just please be careful not to accidentally compare a crude rate to a general rate. I think that's what you need to know about rates. Let's see.